Hey everyone, it's Lexie. So in today's video, I'll be sharing with you my spring reading recommendations. So I think spring is just a really fun time to kind of pick up some books that either have that like wet, soggy spring feel to them, or just books to completely lose yourself in that tell a really complex story. So these are 5 books that I think are perfect to read during the springtime. Starting off, this is a book that is on my shelf, but it's all the way at the top, and I was a little bit lazy and didn't want to get a stool to grab it. But it is The Light Between Oceans by M.L. Stedman. I read this, I want to say back in like 2014, 2015, and I fell in love with this book. It is one that leaves a pit in your stomach because of the ethical dilemma in here. So it follows this lighthouse couple that they kind of live on an island just outside the coast of Australia. And so when they're there, they've been trying for years to have a child, but every time the child is not born alive. And so one day after a storm, this kind of like rescue boat, or kind of like a small boat, washes up to shore, and a man is found dead in there, but he's holding a newborn baby that is still alive. So they just tell everyone that this child is their own, but flash forward several years, they're going back to the mainland, and they discover that the mother of this child, who they presume to have died at sea, is still alive and is still grieving for the loss of her husband and her child. And it kind of goes off from there, and you can kind of see the ethical dilemma of this. And like I said, when I was reading this, I had a pit in my stomach, because it's like just the ethical dilemma of like, this is the family that this girl has known her entire life, or like this mother needs to know that her kid is still alive, and it kind of goes off from there. And it's just like, what would you do in that type of situation? Like, I cried throughout this whole thing. Like, it was a book that really stuck with me, and just to have that, like, to spark that such emotional impact, I think is really unique. And so I think a lot of you guys will enjoy this. I think it's a very interesting read. It's very unique. So, read it kind of with caution, because like I said, this book really upset me for a few days after finishing it. Next up, this is one that I really enjoyed. I read this for a book club with my lab mate and her friends last spring, so that's why it kind of reminded me of spring, but the name of it is, kind of springy to me, and it is Dragonfly by Leila Meacham. And with the dragonfly theme of like, flowers blooming and all that, I kind of like, I don't know, I think of, the bugs coming back to life during the springtime. But this is a World War II historical fiction novel that follows these group of individuals that were recruited by, I want to say, yes, OSS during World War II, where they went in and spied it. They went into Nazi occupied France to spy on the Nazis. And so when this book opens, it is 20 years after the fact, and the main person who oversaw the operation, he's reading a book describing that Operation Dragonfly, I think is what their name is, or like their team name was. He's reading a book that is documenting his team and their contribution to the war effort, but one thing strikes him as something odd and wrong about the paper. It says that every single member of that team came back home alive, which is, from his understanding, is not the case. He assumed that someone was presumed dead, and everyone has thought about that since that day. So we get kind of 2 different storylines. We get the storyline of these people getting recruited, their involvement, and then ultimately their placement in Nazi-occupied France, and their stories and interconnectedness ultimately leading to the events that led to supposedly the death of one of the members, and then these members kind of getting together and trying to figure out what actually happened that day. And I think this was so interesting just because of that like mystery aspect, and you don't know who actually is the one that died. And so you're trying to piece together all these different clues that are led throughout, you know, these people's perspective, and the author did a really good job at kind of weaving the web of these characters and their connectedness within Nazi occupied France, with either the Nazis that they were trying to gain information from, just how everyone was connected to each other. I thought was really well done. This is a really like a standout World War II historical fiction novel. I thought it was really well done, and I don't know, I just think spring when I see this cover, so you know, that's why I threw it in here. So this is the book that speaks to me when I was talking about like wet, soggy spring weather, and this is the book that comes straight to mind, and it is The Forgotten Garden by Kate Morton. This is one of my favorite Kate Morton books, and this kind of takes place in Victorian England during kind of like just like the having that atmosphere of like wet and soggy, you know, UK life. So it follows the story of a girl named Nell and Cassandra. So Cassandra is the granddaughter of Nell, who recently just passed away, and going through Nell's belongings, she stumbles across this very old looking fairy tale book, and there's something unique about this book. Like something draws Cassandra to this book, and she's interested in learning more about, you know, Nell's story. So while she's investigating her grandmother's life, we also kind of get flashbacks to this other character who's growing up in you know, early like late 1800s, early 1900s in England, and her story there, and you don't really know how everything is connected until the end, because you're figuring it out with Cassandra as well. And I think this one is just one you really need to just experience and not know too much about the plot going in. I think this is just like a very bare minimum synopsis of this, and I think that's all you really need to know. Just lose yourself in this world and, you know, soggy UK wet weather, and you know what, I guarantee you will love this book. Just looking at the books that I've compiled for this video, it's clear that I associate springtime with historical fiction, so that you guys are just getting a lot of historical fiction recommendations in this one. This is another book that I read last year that I really enjoyed, and it is The Paris Library by Janet Skeslien Charles. So again, this is another one with a dual storyline. So we follow Oldie, I don't know how to say her French name, but she is a young woman that is working at the American Library in Paris, and eventually follows her story of becoming involved in the resistance during the Nazi occupation in France. And then we flash forward 40 years after that, where we follow Lily, I think the name is, who is a lonely teenager, and she ends up befriending her neighbor, her interesting French elderly neighbor, and it kind of goes off from there. I think it's best, again, not knowing too much about this, but I really think like there's something about like World War II historical fiction in the springtime. I don't know why, but I think this is just a fun book to read. And again, I think the different storylines between the past and present was really well done. Just seeing, ultimately, you know that Oldie as an older individual has regrets, but you don't really get to see them play out. She still has a lot of mysteries as you learn more about her through Lily, and so kind of getting that different perspective as well. You kind of see her in the future and then trying to piece together what eventually happened to make her have so much guilt, I think was really interesting. And what is not to love about a book that, you know, takes place in a library? And lastly, again, this is the final historical fiction recommendation in the last book I'll be recommending in this video, and it is Sunflower Sisters by Martha Hall Kelly. So again, this kind of has a spring cover to it, so but instead of World War II, this focuses on the Civil War. So this is a trilogy that follows the I forget their name, the Faraday family, and so the first book follows Caroline during World War II. The second book follows Eliza, who's Caroline's mother during World War I, and then this follows their like great aunts during the Civil War, which is loosely based off of these true historical, figures. And so this one follows the family during the Civil War. So we get, again, similar with the other books, you don't really necessarily need to read them in order, but I think this one is very good as a standalone because, again, it's an era that I haven't really read a lot from. But this one, similar to the other books, follows 3 different narrations. We follow Georgie Faraday and her experience of wanting to become a nurse, trained to become a nurse to help contribute with the North for the war. Then we follow a slave's perspective and then the slave owner's narration as well. And ultimately, you know how 2 of the storylines are connected, but you don't really know how Georgie fits into this. It kind of goes off from there. But again, I think this one is really interesting because, again, I haven't read anything from this era from a historical fiction point of view. I'm trying to think. I read one, but I don't know if it's necessarily the Civil War era, but this one is definitely a standout. I think it was really interesting seeing how the author tied in a lot of the racism that played a role in slavery and kind of relating it back to kind of modern day. You can see how the events of George Floyd have inspired a lot of the themes in here, which I think is interesting. And again, just how the author is able to weave in these 3 different narrations into something that is, makes the story flow and just connecting them all together. She really does a good job with that, and I think a lot of you guys will as well. Like I said, you don't really need, I feel like each book is its own standalone, but they are connected throughout time, so you don't really need to read all 3 of them. You can read them in any order you want, really. But I think this one is really a standout because it is unique, because I do like my historical fiction that is around the World Wars, but I haven't read anything surrounding the Civil War, so I think it makes it for a very unique and important read. So that's it, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what some of your spring reading recommendations are and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, guys.